.NET Cloud Native with Brady Gaster.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm helping companies build mission-critical software systems, and you can find them on clearmeasure.com. A quick announcement, we are in our second year of my architect forums. You can sign up for them at the link in the show notes, and this is for people who are leading software teams. There's plenty of educational information out there online for how to program and learning new technologies, but not so much for how to lead groups of programmers. So if you are in a lead architect role or developer lead role, or even manager role, direct manager, you can just sign up for the architect forum at the show notes. It's free. It's a community of peers helping each other out. And for those of you who are looking for Programming with Palermo, which is my video podcast, you can just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. I have a returning guest today on the show, Brady Gaster, back from episode 221 when we were talking about Orleans. He is a principal program manager on the .NET and Visual Studio team at Microsoft, where he works on SignalR, microservices, APIs, Orleans, .NET Native, integration with Azure services, in the hopes of making it exciting for developers who work with .NET apps to just party on in the cloud. Brady, welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm doing good, man. Busy as always, but doing well. I guess I should add .NET Aspire to that list of things because that's really what I've been working on recently.
Yeah, that's coming out this year too. Exciting stuff.
It is indeed. It can't get here soon enough, believe me.
Right. Well, before we jump into all the tech stuff for listeners who haven't heard you on the show before, you've done a lot of stuff at Microsoft now and before that. But what are the highlights maybe in your career where it was clear to you that you wanted to work on this kind of technology and it really jazzed you up? What kind of led you into the spot you're at now?
Those questions are always interesting. Before the show, Jeff and I were talking about DJing because we both like to DJ in various contexts. And somebody asked me one time, they said, what is, of all the different, consulting gigs and different things that you've done, like what best prepared you for your role at Microsoft? I think at the time I was on the keynote crew. And I said, throwing parties, like throwing concerts, throwing parties, moving from, warehouse to warehouse. And they were like, I never would have thought that would be the answer. And I'm like, you got to be ready to bob and weave. You got to be ready to move. Like, it's always changing.
Yeah.
I'd probably still stick to that. Big things I've done. I don't know. Big things. If you've seen the deploy to Azure button, I worked on that with our mutual good friend, the late great Vittorio Bertocci. He and I worked on the deploy to Azure button that you've probably seen in the portal. It kind of sucks in ARM templates and generates provisioning logic. That was kind of a fun little side project we did. With all due respect to Damian Brady, I've done a lot of the right-click publish work that you'll see, and I would append his thing and say, to production.
Right.
Damian, please listen to me. The dev is fine as long as you have access. So that's what I'm doing now is working on the crew that does essentially right-click publish. I moved over there from the runtime crew. I was doing like ASP.NET runtime stuff for a while. I've been the SignalR kind of head cheerleader for most of my career at Microsoft. And then I started working on distributed stuff like Orleans, building out cloud native apps. But I've moved around Microsoft a lot. When I came to Microsoft, 13 years ago, that's my unlucky year, I guess. When I came to Microsoft, I kind of had this mission of understanding how we interface with developers in all the possible angles. So I've worked in the product group twice. I've been an evangelist, what they call an advocate now. I was in the marketing team for a little while, building out keynotes. That's how I got to know Isaac and a lot of other folks in the community. I worked on Docs MS-Com, which eventually grew up into Learn. I was the reference PM over there. And I've worked on the Azure SDK team, which I still partner with pretty closely because I'm kind of the .NET and Azure person. So I work with Scott Addy and the folks over in the SDK team to make sure, like my tagline says, that devs have a good way to party in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, led us to .NET Aspire in the .NET 8 and 9 timeframe. Because, Glenn and Damien and David had this, we all had this goal of making .NET great to run on Linux and great to run in Kubernetes, and clearly great to run in containers.
Mm-hmm.
And .NET Aspire is kind of the next evolution of that journey. We've kind of built like an opinionated, componentized cloud native stack that you can build stuff on top of. It's not just the tools like Project Tie, if you remember that, but it's also components and publishing and integration with Azure and the whole kit and caboodle, if you will. So it's been a long journey. It's been fun. Worked on a lot of good things. Been really blessed. So
yeah, cool. For sure. I wanted to touch on just a little bit of history because I realized you mentioned right-click publish and in Visual Studio, a publish menu item, and people who are coming to Visual Studio just in the last say 5 years probably don't know this context. Why some of the old timers argue over right-click publish and whatnot is because way back 15 years ago, there was a publish menu item that did some great things and it published. But there was no command line corollary. Like all the logic was just baked into Visual Studio. And there was a big, hubbub. It's like, come on, we got to automate this stuff. And there's not the named developer clicking that button with their mouse.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's a totally different world. It's like, you got the tooling, but it's not because that's the only way to do it. It's because that tooling is on top of the stuff that you could also do the exact same thing command line, right?
Exactly. That's actually the most exciting part about it, kind of like you're alluding to, stupid history. There was a point where I was working with Guang Yang and Hunter and some other Matt Gibbs and Jeff Wilcox and some really smart folks on the Azure SDK team when it was like 20 people. Now it's way more people than that, thank goodness. But we used to have 2 PMs on the team. And one of the things that we did there was we worked on various CLIs and SDKs, like I said. And that's what there was the publishing crew when I was working in BS. And I remember talking to the publishing guys. I was like, so y'all don't use any of the SDKs from the SDK team? And they were like, no, we just hit the APIs directly. Like, that's interesting. So it kind of felt like for years, it was like, let me try to get these two teams a little closer. What I'm excited about is with .NET Aspire, one of the things we wanted to do was not only enable you to, hit F5 and have all your projects start up at once, but also to be able to essentially right-click publish your whole topology, So that meant, let's say you have 10 projects in your solution, let's say it's eShop. I'd like to be able to click once and publish it all. That was going to be difficult with our tech. However, that was not difficult with some partner tech you might know as AZD, the Azure Developer CLI. So we partnered with the AZD team, and now what we're shipping in the .NET Aspire timeframe is actually tightly integrated with AZD. We work closely with them, and I don't know if you used AZD, but the idea is you can do AZD init, and it'll kind of create your environment, and then you can do AZD provision. It'll create all your stuff in the cloud, then you do AZD deploy, and poof, all your containers go up into the cloud. But you would have to write a lot of IAC. You'd have to write a lot of bicep, a lot of YAML, et cetera, et cetera. So we worked closely with that team, and we said what we would really like is for y'all to just kind of understand the components of an Aspire project and kind of know how to take what's in the C# code and transpile it, transmogrify it, if you remember Marvin the Martian, over to the IAC, and then just do the right thing. Just do what you do like 1,000 times. And they said okay. So now when you right-click publish inside of VS, we're actually calling AZD under the covers and doing all that stuff. Now, what does that mean for folks like us that are really big into CI/CD? You can literally take those CI scripts and write them as GitHub action files, and the same thing will happen whenever you want to, do your pushes from CI/CD. So it's exactly the same experience. We are planning on bringing that kind of the last step when you do right-click publish on, say, a web app. The last step in that experience is, do you want us to create a GitHub action for you? And we go, yeah, sure. So that last step just generates the GitHub action for you. We're going to bring that same kind of capability to .NET Aspire projects with AZD. I don't know if we'll get it before GA, but I promise to share a gist or guest, depending on how you say it, with the community that we've literally copied across like a dozen or so of our samples, and it works every time. It's kind of weird. The only time you'd have to change it if, like, let's say with the eShop repo, for instance. eShop's kind of our big microservices sample. We've been using it for years. We've significantly updated it for Aspire. We've added AI to it because we add AI to things, and now it's a lot more modern. But you can actually right-click deploy that project from within VS. But that project also contains Maui projects in the solution. So there's an accompanying SLNF file, I believe, that sits next to it. That's really just the web stuff and the cloud stuff. So the only change we've had to make is on that repo, and the only change was instead of it being .NET publish, it was .NET publish the name of the file.
Okay.
So that was the only change we've had to make. So it's pretty nice to see that like AZD has really made that whole thing ubiquitous, and we're just sitting on top of it. So it's good.
Yeah.
Kind of. Yeah.
Well, we've had Scott Hunter on the show talking about Aspire, and it's come up in some other conversations. Shane Boyer's been on the show again. I should probably have him back, because he's kind of one of the movers and shakers with Azure Developer at the AZD. But in this whole world of just native cloud apps with .NET, am I right in saying that the kind of underlying assumption is that we're containerizing what we're throwing at Azure, and we're generally running most of the compute workloads in Azure Container Apps in this new world, or is that a wrong assumption?
That's a great assumption. We looked at the landscape of orchestrated container PaaS as we were building out Aspire, and ACA was definitely the thing we wanted to party on first. It's an orchestrated environment. It has a lot of the goodness of Azure kind of baked into it. It's got Dapper baked into it. There are also Dapper Aspire components. It had support for Orleans and everything, everything .NET under the sun. It makes sense for devs who were, dipping their toe into the orchestrated containerized world to, try out something like Azure Container Apps or one of the, competitive products, as long as they're not interested yet in learning the complexity of Kubernetes or having to bite that off. So we chose ACA first because they're a fun team to partner with.
Yeah.
It was kind of the obvious choice for folks who wanted to do a container pass but didn't want to get down with all the Kubernetes isms. And we've had a lot of fun building this stuff out. The AZD team's clearly invested in the container apps deployment target. We definitely want to build out a more premier experience for publishing to Kubernetes. I don't have a time frame for it, as soon as humanly possible. There is an open source contribution in the Aspire repositories called Aspirate. It's a really, really great contribution. It's contributed by the community, and our team's reviewed it and done commits on it. If you want to deploy an Aspire app to Azure Container Apps, I would definitely say AZD is going to be your best way, or the stuff in VS that we're shipping on top of AZD. If you're going to Kubernetes, and I notice I just said Kubernetes, they could be AKS, EKS, GKS, any of them. Local Docker desktop Kubernetes. Aspirate is really going to be your choice for now.
Cool.
We're looking at that tool. It's a great tool. It's always difficult when you want to build on top of an open source thing. That gets weird. So we'll see how that goes. But publishing to Kubernetes, obviously, AKS is going to be my priority.
Yeah.
Because I'm the Azure publishing guy. I don't have a time frame for that, but I can definitely tell you, I'd like to do that by the end of the year. I would like to have already done it, but resource time.
Yeah. Well, Kubernetes has, Docker had explosive growth, and then the Kubernetes project on top of it said, "Hey, let's make all these fail-safe, clusterized way to run a whole bunch of containers." And then on top of that, Azure's built stuff on top of that, and then the Argo community has had their flavor for how to make Kubernetes a little bit more manageable. And now Azure Container Environments and Container Apps is like the Azure layer on top of AKS to say, all right, we don't need all those knobs all the time. Let's make that a little bit more approachable.
Exactly.
So there's so many ways that the industry as a whole is coming at the problem of, okay, the containerized package for something handwave that is running online in a cloud provider is good, but now we need to make it usable and approachable and fast and easy. So can you give us the rundown on the tool chain? Because I think sometime later this year, Aspire is going to have the Visual Studio part, but connecting from our C# and maybe, everybody has, let's say, a web application, some backend job, and a SQL database. Now they probably have a lot more stuff, but those three tend to be pretty darn common across a whole bunch of apps. What's the full chain when you say, you know what? No, I'm going to be Azure native. Like everything here is going to be, designed to fit nicely in Azure offerings. You mentioned AZD and some other things, but what is the sequence of the chain and where are the connections in that world?
That makes sense. I mean, I'll definitely take an Aspire first, kind of mentality to that. The way we're building Aspire today, it's got to be .NET 8. So, you need to upgrade your stuff to .NET 8.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's say you're starting something new. You could essentially do file new Aspire starter project, and that will give you a front end and a back end that are totally wired up so that the front end can talk to the back end. We had, Poly for resiliency. We had health checkery. All these other, things that you would have to do. Open telemetry. We go ahead and dial all that in for you as well. So that if you're using Grafana, Prometheus, Azure Monitor, any of it, you can output your stuff to it, not only your metrics, but also your distributed traces and your logging.
Mm-hmm.
So that is all built in for you. So essentially, you can either do file new, or let's say you have a front end and a back end already built, and you're like, this Aspire thing, yeah, sounds right. You can literally right-click your project inside of Visual Studio Preview, point that out, 1710 Preview and beyond. You can essentially right-click your project and say, add Aspire orchestration. And if you don't have an Aspire, what's called an app host project, which is really that thing that fires up the runtime, it's a under the covers runtime that, it's kind of like Thai when you hit F5 and everything was spin up.
Mm-hmm.
You basically, add that add Aspire orchestration to your project. We drop in, the projects that you need, wire up all the references the way you need them. And now when you hit F5, what starts up is your app host. And it goes, I need to start up this project and this project. Now, as long as you're running in that context, things like service discovery are automatic. And now you want to add things like a database. And so you would start to add, let's say, the SQL entity framework component.
Mm-hmm.
There's an Aspire component for all of these things. You would essentially add that to your project. Now, what that does is it doesn't, let me be clear on this, Aspire is not a series of abstractions. It's a stack that gives you the stuff in your DI IOC layer that you know and love. So let's take Redis or SQL as like a for instance. Let's say you use Stack Exchange Redis today and you're familiar with those APIs. You would essentially, in your Aspire project, in your app host, you would say, builder, your distributed application builder .add Redis, and that's it. You don't have to add anything to DI. You don't have to inject anything. You just do add Redis. And then in the project that you want to use that Redis database, you say the same thing, add Redis, and it wires it all up for you. The connection strings are, something that happens automatically for you. Being, your front end being able to hit it is something that happens automatically for you. All that stuff, we just dial all those components in for you. Now, if you want to say use the Redis database to send messages, or if you want to write data to it, all you would need to do is, create a minimal, a minimal API endpoint. That's my jam.
Mm-hmm.
Or, a controller or a view or whatever else. You just say injects and you pass in, the Redis client, boom, it's there. And instead of you having to do builder.services.add, blah, 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 blah,
mm-hmm.
we just do all that for you. And now the things that you know and love are there. So the same thing would be true for like a SQL client, or if you're using one of our entity framework specific components. So you've got SQL with entity framework, Postgres with entity framework. You would essentially just say, I want to add a SQL DB context to my application. Poof, you've got one. And now whenever you want to, get that DB context out, you would just inject it into the constructor or class somewhere and you get it out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that we're adding a whole bunch of new concepts for you to learn. We're adding simplicity on top of the concepts you already know, and making it easier for you to, connect the dots. Like everybody hates networking. Everybody hates service discovery.
Yeah.
So the way you do it in Aspire is you basically create a back end and you create a front end, and you literally in your app host, you say front end dot with reference and you pass it to back end, and it goes, oh, okay, cool. I'll just inject environment variables into the front end app when I fire it up so that it knows how to get to the back end. It's pretty simple. It's like things you would probably build at home.
So it's environment variables, not config files.
Correct.
And
Correct.
so,
It's environment variables, not config files, and some secrets. Like if you add key vault,
okay,
you can specify which things to go to key vault.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
so I'm guessing in the configuration, you're adding the environment handler automatically to the services collection for configuration. So when I look at a key and I don't find it in the config file, it immediately then goes and checks to see if it can find it in environment variables, right, and then it's there.
Right. Exactly right.
Cool.
And that's that's one set of things that we do. Another one that we do, here's an interesting, funny one. So one of the things that we wanted to build into the product was the way for you to, let's take Redis. Redis is a great example. When you F5, you really just want to use a Redis container. Like you want to bring down the Redis container, launch it using whatever, Podman, Docker, what have you.
Yep.
And then party on, but let's say when you deploy to Azure, you might want to use Azure Cache for Redis. So what we wanted to do was to give you the capability of using either those containerized services when you're running locally, or when you're publishing, we would give you the capability to grab a hold of a connection string. So in the app host language, we've actually got run as and publish as idioms, so that you can have if then switches. If I'm in development, run as a local container, otherwise publish as a connection string to some Azure resource. Now, if you're deving locally with something like OpenAI, in the old days, it was, get your code, write your code, provision your resources, and then deploy your app. Today, it's get your code, provision your resources that you need to run your code locally, configure your code locally, and then run your code, and then make tweaks, and then publish. Because you've got to use those online resources to actually even dev locally. So gone are the days of deving on the plane. What Fowler and the crew have done is they've actually built in this really awesome feature called Add Azure Provisioning, which is like if you create a bunch of references to these different online resources, like OpenAI, when you hit F5, it goes, oh, I see that you need these resources. I'm just going to go create them for you. Now, guys like you and me, that should probably make us a little bit nervous, because that means devs are going to F5 to provision.
Yeah.
Okay.
And start incurring costs.
It's kind of scary. So if you are, if you're like us and you've got an Azure subscription somewhere that you can party on, like kind of like however you want to, those kinds of environments are really, really awesome, because you can just F5, provision, and now your code's running. Not everybody has those kinds of setups. I mean, we've talked to some customers who have 500 Azure subscriptions for every developer in the company, and they can do whatever they want, but they can only do it in their sub.
Right. And
then when they want to go to, they have to go through platform engineering or DevOps or whatever else. Now, remember, we're using AZD. So, AZD
to make a plug for anyone who's involved with management anywhere, there absolutely has to be a per developer Azure subscription solution. And I mean, it starts with if you have the top level Visual Studio Enterprise subscription, you get the 150 or 200 minutes per month. I mean, every developer needs some level. It's just necessary. So if you're a manager out there, that's just a need. I'm almost like caffeine. They need to have the Azure subscription access.
I totally agree. I manage our .NET R&D subscription here on the team. We have these internal subscriptions. And I can tell you that when we added this feature to the product, I just kind of sat here one day and went, oh my God, I'm going to have to write an app to clean up the subscription now.
That's true.
And it's an R&D subscription. It's going to get dirty. Our internal subscriptions, we have cleanup routines that run on them. I wrote mine in Aspire. So, I've actually got an app that folks use and they can tag and delete and whatever else. So they don't have to go to the portal and because a lot of our folks, they're .NET people. They're not necessarily Azure.
Yeah.
So it's been interesting to watch some of these real world problems kind of come about. But like I said, like I was kind of alluding to, we're using AZD for all of our published stuff. One of the interesting, cool, alpha, hopefully they add it, it's not alpha features of AZD is this really great feature. I have to kind of motion to my synth here called AZD infra synth. Okay. What AZD infra synth will do is instead of just running your bicep, it'll dump it. So it'll drop it to disk. So let's say you're a platform engineer and you don't ever give your devs access to a subscription that they can party on. They could literally build their whole application up and do AZD infra synth and hand over that IAC, and then you could run it, and then they could deploy to it. So it actually kind of satisfies both sides of that coin. We're trying to make that a little more refined. Like I said, we're definitely integrating pretty tightly with the Azure SDK team and using some of their toys. But what we want to do is make it easy for folks like me who basically want to party on their sub as admins or owners, and easy for folks like me who also want to control that stuff with CI/CD.
Yeah.
So we're trying to solve both of those problems. We're definitely going to solve the first one first. So we're definitely optimizing for your dev experience. So folks like me, welcome to this world. It's challenging and exciting. So
can I ask you about environments? Just recognizing that there's a new world coming up, and then there's people are used to certain things. So there was a time when I think the message was, hey, you better get on GitHub Actions because that's the new future. And then, the Azure DevOps team is restaffed up and Azure Pipelines is growing super fast, as well. And then you also got, tools like Octopus Deploy that have, really good market share. And in those worlds, you have the tool that has the knowledge of named environments and the order of named environments. And it's in the configuration of that tool. And actually the code of the application, it really doesn't know that there's 3 environments or 5 environments or 7 environments on the way to production. And so in this new world with AZD and Aspire, does that change? And if so, what?
That's a really good question. It kind of reminds me, I have to pick on Tim for a second. Tim Lawyer, my boss. We were chatting the other day, and Tim and I have been in the Azure ecosystem for a really long time. But when you introduce certain Azureisms to .NET, it kind of makes you jar, just a little bit, because some of those things don't. .NET historically was enterprisey, so the cloud's a little bit different. And we're going through the experience of doing right-click publish, and we get to the box that says environment name.
Yeah.
And some of the people that have never really gotten down with that part of the world, they're just I hate that environment name thing. And I'm like, you gotta have it. You've got to have dev, production 2, backup.
Well, even if you only have sandbox and production, you still have something other than production.
Exactly. So and they're like, yeah. And I'm like, no, it's not a yeah. It's that should be a thing. That's how you think. And I'm like you, there was a point in time where I didn't write code unless it was NANT or MS Build or some form of CI/CD logic. It changes the way you think about your apps. Yeah. When you're no longer thinking about it works on my machine, it's got to work on every machine. It just makes you think a little differently. And I think Aspire and AZD work well together because the things that Aspire is trying to make cloud easy for .NET. There's some things that you can't make easy by default, and AZD just takes care of that for you. So it's really great to see the 2 products kind of hand in hand working together. It's 2 different sides of the hallway, so it's really, really fun. It's kind of that one Microsoft thing. But it's going to be a cool future, I think, to really kind of make .NET devs think not only from the cloud native perspective, from container orchestration, but from different environments. When I'm in dev, I'm using containers and it can be, those containers could go up and down. My database might go poof. You know what I mean? That's the way you think in dev. You don't want to think that way in prod. So we really kind of force you into that. Okay, what am I doing when I'm running locally versus what am I doing when I'm publishing? And in AZD is really going to carry the baton of named environments. Go here and go here and go here. You mentioned all those tools. Another one is the Azure developer environments. that's something we're trying to integrate with pretty tightly too. Some exciting ideas with those two products working together. So.
Yeah, we'll have to go into that before because we haven't talked about Azure development environments on the podcast.
Yeah, those are cool.
But just to make sure I get specifics for the listeners, with any of the automatic deployment products, the pipeline knows the name of the environment and it kind of passes in the name of the environment as a variable into common scripts that run, for every environment. Does that stay unchanged and it's just passed into Aspire or passed into AZD, or does Aspire or AZD become the system of record for the names of the environments?
AZD is more the system of record for the names of the environments. Aspire, we're going to have, you could in your Aspire code do name switches.
Mm-hmm.
I'd prefer you do like is development. That's different. There's kind of an idiom for is development.
Yeah.
If you've got like is Jeff's dev 2, is Jeff's, that's when it gets a little weird because those environments are going to go up and down.
Yeah.
Aspire's not. There's nothing built into Aspire to systematically handle your named environments. I would encourage you to defer that to AZD.
Okay.
Or your runner. And in your Aspire code, I would say, if your environment contains dev, if your environment contains stage, et cetera, et cetera. But again, if you look in the preview for what's new release notes in our docs, I can give you the link for that.
Yeah.
If you look in those docs, you'll see that we're beginning this idiom of like run as and publish as.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea behind those is so you can literally, kind of have control over when I'm running locally, I'm using this. When I'm running in the cloud, I'm using that. And you can more low level control that. I'm getting you the preview for link right now. I'll give
cool.
Give you
yeah,
that.
we'll include that in the show notes. As you're talking about that, if AZD, I know a lot of this is going to flesh out,
okay.
but a longstanding principle has kind of been, hey, the application should just know what it is, and it shouldn't have to care if it's in test environment 2 or 3 or whatever the named environment is. I know .NET has built in like production or dev kind of as concepts, but some people have five test environments just depending on what they need. That's fine, but the application really shouldn't care. It shouldn't be hard coded to know about an environment. But then you got AZD scripts, and at some level, you need to store all this and version control it. And I'm kind of reminded of the GitOps movement out there that's really asking the question, okay, how do we want to organize ops scripts and code that's separate from application code? And so that's interesting to think about.
It is. So think about the structure of an Aspire project or Aspire solution. You've got, let's say you've got your front end Blazor app, and then you've got a back end API app.
Mm-hmm.
So those are two projects. You're going to have two other projects in your solution at pretty much a minimum. One of them is going to be what we currently call the service defaults or the app defaults. And that's kind of where we wire up things like observability.
Mm-hmm.
We don't put those in as libraries you just call. I mean, there are libraries you call, but we also give you the code.
Mm-hmm.
And the code is essentially the defaults that we kind of recommend written as code, so that if you don't like those defaults, you can go in and you can tweak it. Sometimes I'll turn off resiliency if I'm testing something and I don't want it to keep pinging. You know what I mean? So things like that. And you can basically turn off health checks or turn them on, But the one project that you get that's like, that service default is essentially a class library. You were asking me kind of about the stack. That app host project is a non-deployable thing. The app host is essentially, when you look at an app host, it's got one file in it, program CS.
Mm-hmm.
When you look in program CS, you can sort of visualize your entire application topology just looking at that file, because you can see all of your dependencies, and then you can see your front ends, and then you can see your back ends and how they reference one another. And you kind of go, it's actually my favorite part of Aspire is looking at program CSs and app hosts. But you don't deploy that. That's not like running code. What that does is it drives the F5. All right.
It's a startup project, local startup project.
Exactly. It's sort of like what was it called back in the VB days? Like a a WBAM, is that like a web app deployment project or something like that? Yeah.
No, it's ancient history.
It's ancient. Yes, it's sort of like we were joking, like, oh, is it like a web app? So it's sort of like that. But what it does today, this may evolve a little bit from like internals.
Yeah.
But what it does today is it exposes the Aspire app model. That app model can generate essentially a manifest, and that manifest can then be turned into IAC code. So when you write your app host and you basically say, okay, build, it goes, oh, what are you, is ASP.NET Core underscore environment production or development?
Mm-hmm.
And then in your code, you've got if dev, if not dev. That code basically changes what gets output in that manifest, which changes that IAC, which changes your deployment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if you're publishing a dev, you might get a bunch of container apps like Redis container apps. If you're publishing to production, it might not provision a container app for your Redis because it goes, oh, I've got a connection string. Don't provision anything.
Right.
Or a database. So,
and almost every .NET application that has a SQL database, like, is it locally? Or are you just running SQL local DB versus provisioning Azure SQL up in the cloud, or is it opinionated like that?
It is very opinionated. I'm trying to get the SQL docs for you right now. You can you can do run as, and you could run like the local SQL container,
mm-hmm.
Or you could do run as and give it like an actual connection string to say your local database that you've got running on your machine, or an Azure SQL database. So you could feed it a connection string that you wire up somewhere, or you could just say run it as a container, and poof, you get a container. And that way, each time you restart, you get a new one. That's kind of convenient.
Right.
Like let's say you've got migrations you want to run each time you start your app.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. This is some good stuff. I'm looking forward to it.
Good. You should definitely go play with it. We're going to release Preview 5 soon. I have some writing to do this week. But nice. Preview 5 is going to be, like, if you've been tinkering with Aspire through the former previews, Preview 5 is going to be kind of a speed bump. It's going to be like 4 was a big speed bump.
Mm-hmm.
5 won't be as big of a speed bump. There'll be some significant changes on the deeper parts, like the app model and whatnot. But Preview 5 is really where we want to try to lock as many of the APIs, if not all of the APIs, as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's good for me because I'm the right-click publish guy. So if they don't lock their APIs, like right. We're running really
you can't build it on top.
Yeah. So 5 seems like it's going to be a lock point. So once you see David Pine release the article on .NET Aspire Preview 5, that's the one you kind of want to like start partying on. That's when you're nice. Really getting close to what we're going to be shipping. It's getting exciting, but we still need your feedback. So please try it out. Please submit issues. And Aspire is not one of those things that. Yeah, I'm going to say it's done on GA day.
Mm-hmm.
We're treating Aspire like a startup. It's like something everybody's really gung ho about. We're all trying to find new ways to use it. We're making videos about it. We're making teaser videos for those videos.
Yeah.
It's exciting, but we definitely want folks to try it and give us your feedback on what we can concentrate on in the subsequent releases. So.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, to kind of wrap it up, we'll include the links that we've talked about, and you mentioned the docs, and is that is there anything on Microsoft Learn just yet, or because it's in preview, it's more than the dev blogs?
Oh, that's a great question. David and I talked about it really early on, and we both agreed having preview docs is something we wanted to do this time.
Okay.
So we've actually had previews. We've had docs on Learn MS-COM since preview 1. So David Pine and the other writers, Alex Wolf and Cam, are working really, really hard to keep everything going. Each release, we have a big docs triage. Docs is definitely a part of the product. The Learn link that I gave you goes to our What's New, but I'll give you a Learn link directly to the hub page right now as well, so you can actually share that with folks too. That's our docs page for Aspire. And we're trying to get as many of the different, those Azure services we know people need to have in the box. But we've also got this concept called a bicep resource,
mm-hmm.
where if you needed to customize it or add some, service that we don't support yet with a component, you can actually inject your own bicep and party on it.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be used all the time because all these legacy components or slightly older things that nobody's going to make a Spire wrapper for. So it's custom component 1, custom component 2.
Exactly. So you'll see a lot of that, and we've got other cloud providers, submitting pull requests as well. So if it's not Azure where you run it, I'll convince you to come. But if it's not Azure where you want to run your .NET code, we're working with other cloud partners to be able to provide the great functionality for their components as well.
Nice. Well, Brady, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast and sharing with us the kind of the latest in the world of .NET Cloud natives. Really interesting. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Well, my pleasure. My pleasure. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.